I'm here with Andrew Harvey. Great to be with you, Andrew. He's the author
Lovely
of
to be with you.
author
A
of over
poor
30
guy, he's
books,
in Costa Rica. He's living a very hard life, and I've decided
struggling.
to cheer him up.
You just outed me as being in Costa Rica. Like,
Am I allowed to do that?
yeah, you are, yeah.
Oh, okay, good.
So, and we're author of over 30 books, including Sacred Activism and The Way of Passion. Co-author of one of my favorite books when I was a young man, which is the Tibetan Book of the Living and the Dying,
Yeah,
which
thank
sold
you.
over millions of copies.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about your new book, Engoldenment, and your work on sacred activism and how spirituality can help us rather than make things worse during the pandemic.
Yes.
Right?
I
I
love
mean,
it.
I'd love to ask you. I mean, you've got such a fascinating life, and there's so many different parts of it I could ask you about. But just, I mean, first of all, you were a fellow at All Souls at 21.
Yes.
Is doing English literature at Oxford like me, but then you kind of you reacted. You did not enjoy All Souls by the sound of it. So tell us a little bit about.
Oh, well, Oscar Wilde said, if you want to punish someone, give them exactly what they want.
Mm,
And so when I was at Oxford reading English, I dreamed of being in this celestial college. And I got in and I became the youngest fellow. And in many, many ways, I did enjoy it because I met completely extraordinary people like Isaiah Berlin, who became a great buddy. And of course, I met Iris Murdoch, who became my closest friend. And we carried on drinking copious amounts of red wine and talking about life and death and sex and God knows what. And all of that was wonderful. But I began to realize that there was something deeply crazy about the whole system, the West. Very early on, I realized we were on a headlong course for destruction, and
mm,
nobody else seemed to be noticing this. And I realized that there was a tremendous dissociation from life
mm,
in at the elitist levels that I was being introduced to.
right.
I'll tell you one story which really gets it all. One day, the Prime Minister, was Margaret Thatcher at the time, came to dinner and we were all lined up and she was in a steel blue gown.
Mm,
And there was this Australian sociologist who was visiting who was always amazingly drunk because his wife had left him quite sensibly. And when she came near him, he fell over, literally in front of the Prime Minister. We were all in a line to say hello. And she just stepped over him. She didn't even notice. And I thought, that's the whole thing. The elite just steps over the dead, the crazy, the broken, the wretched. And I thought, I've got to get out of here. So when I was 25, I went back to India where I'd been born. I was born in India. I spent my first 9 years in India. I'm an Indian in a European body.
yeah.
And I went back and everything changed for me because that was when I started having outrageous mystical experiences, which were very humbling because I thought I knew everything and I would now enter a world in which I knew absolutely nothing.
It's so interesting, the intersection of kind of academia and mysticism, two such
Oh, there's
different
no
worlds.
intersection in England.
And
And
isn't
let me
there?
tell you another story about ourselves. You'll love this. I came back from India and I'd had some really extraordinary experience through the grace of the beloved. And I started to talk about them at lunch, and there was an absolute dead silence. And then one of the guys whom I really loved, who was my mentor, who was a man called Michael Howard, who was a great military historian and the most wonderful, dignified man. And he loved me. He thought I was crazy, but he loved me. And he said, come and see me after lunch, Andrew. I've got something very important to tell you. So I ran up the stairs to see him. And there was Michael, very grand, standing. He said, sit down, dear boy. He said, never, ever talk about mysticism. It's something for private contemplation or for Americans, which was when I, because he
Oh
realized
God. I
that, of
mean,
course, that,
talking about this stuff in England is hard, of course.
well, it's impossible because the English have become absolutely addicted to irony and skepticism. And of course, that's wonderful. They're very good at both, and their wit is fabulous and all the rest of it. But I could never have continued in England. I could never have lived out my life in England because it would have been just as a sort of indulged crazy person on the extreme margins.
Now you followed the mystical path instead,
Yes,
and I know that the idea of the Divine Mother has been very important to you. Now,
yes.
another thing that you and I have in common, we both were raised in boarding schools,
Oh
and of course
God,
taken away
yes.
from the actual mother.
Oh
And
yes.
and I wondered, like, like this used to be the training for empire, because you'd be taken away from your actual mother and you'd serve Britannia instead, right?
Britannia, yes.
But and do you think that that your search
Where
for the
did you
Divine
go?
Mother? I'm psychoanalyzing you now,
Oh,
but
oh,
is
don't worry. I love. I actually did 11 years of psychoanalysis with a fantastic Jungian, and I loved him. He was one of the greatest Jungian analysts, a man called Nathan Schwartzland. And I decided to do analysis with him because after the first session, I said, "Well, what do you think? Do you think we're going to get on?" And he said, "Oh, yes, we're going to find some wonderful monsters together." And we did. But oh, yes, no.
because I read that you had a kind of beautiful but rather distant mother. So is this the kind
Oh,
of
she wasn't distant. She was deeply narcissistic, very crazy, very destructive, and very wonderful and charismatic. So she completely screwed my whole life up,
right,
which
right,
is
right.
wonderful because you don't really get to the mystical path except through multiple breakdowns of all of your possibilities and illusions. And my
Oh,
mother ensured from an early age that I had to find the mother or die. Quite honestly, I'm
mm,
being flip about it, but it was like that. And I got to love my mother and appreciate her, and I forgave her the outrageous behavior that she inflicted on me. But what happened was I was abandoned at 6, basically. I was sent off to boarding school at 6. Can you imagine? And it was they were living in Delhi and it was 2,000 miles away. And it was in a school that she'd actually been to. So the girls went up to 17 and the boys went up to 9. So basically, the boys were kept as pets by the girls. And I was the pet of Manisha Soni, who painted fuchsias and was the most incredible netball. And I adored her. I thought she was fantastic. But what that did to my psyche was very extreme because I really experienced tragic loss much too young and I didn't know what to do with it.
boarding
So there
school is
was this
awful.
great mother wound. And in my 20s, when I was in my return to India, which I went back to India when I was 25, I went to a place called Pondicherry and I met a wonderful guy there. We had adjoining huts by the sea, and he was a mystical poet from Canada. He wrote in French, and his poems were extremely indecipherable, but I thought there was something magical about him. And he was a wonderful, absolutely amazing person. And he
Yeah.
was the only person who, when I said, "Oh, God doesn't exist, the whole world's meaningless, I want to kill myself," he would just, instead of saying, "Oh, how dreadful," he would just scream with laughter. And I was very miffed because I thought, God, how dare you laugh at me? I'm fellow of all souls. I've already written my first book of poems, a lot better than yours, and you're laughing at me. But I realized after a while that he was onto something. So he said, okay, look, come to the tomb of Aurobindo, this great evolutionary mystic who lived in Pondicherry, and just meditate. All you have to do is sit there and try and clear your overstocked, overeducated mind and just try once or twice. So I said, okay, I love you. I believe you're a good person. And without believing anything, I went and sat by the tomb every morning for a week. And at the end of the week, I had an immense vision. I saw the Andromeda Nebula, I'm not kidding you, swirling around at the top of the tomb. And I was open eyes and I heard the voice of the mother. And she said, I am the mother. I've created everything. I live in and as everything. Everything's created in ecstasy. Everything is carried on in ecstasy, and everything will return to ecstasy. That's what she said. And I thought, oh my God, the heat has got to me. I am going crazy. This will completely ruin my career. I'll have to go into an asylum. I'll have to, I'll be dressed in one of those straitjackets. But of course, I realized something unbelievable had happened. And then everything started to open up, open up, open up. I began to see the divine light. I was
Mm.
in it. I was by the sea one night in Pondicherry, and suddenly everything, uh, the whole sand started to glow with light. And I noticed that my footprints were glowing with light. So immediately I thought, well, I must be Jesus or something. And then I noticed that everybody else's footprints on the sand would
Aha.
fade. So I realized, oh my
My
God, this
God.
light for everybody. It's not just for Andrew Harvey, fellow of all souls.
Uh-huh.
It was an amazing opening because I opened to God as mother. And I've been brought up in Anglicanism, and I'd always had a love for Jesus, and then had become a Marxist in my uh, teens because I wanted to destroy everything and rebuild everything. You know how you are when you're 17, 18. But to discover God as mother, oh my God, to discover the motherhood of God, and that God is a mother and a father, and of course neither and beyond anything, but especially that mother side which is so tender, so loving, so empowering, so
Mm.
enfolding. And because of the wound that I had as a child, I opened to that.
Right,
And
right.
that
That's
became
interesting.
research.
And you've said about how our wounds are where kind of awakening happens and where we find
Mm.
our mission and that kind of thing.
You
Now,
know
in
that
that,
line by Leonard Cohen, "The crack is where the light comes in."
yeah,
Our
yeah,
traumas and our wounds are the karmic doorways that we can
yeah.
go through to find the divine. It's a
I
very
believe
strange
that.
system, but
It
I
is.
have a
It
few
is.
quarrels with it, but it works.
It works. Now,
Mm.
you for a while followed gurus, and you would
Yes.
meet these illustrious gurus, and they were obviously kind of saw something in you because they then ask you to write books about them invariably,
Oh no, well, Tuksay
or to
Rinpoche
books
wasn't
with them.
the great master I met in Ladakh. I would never call him a guru. He was a Buddha, and he was authentic. And his reincarnation has become my buddy.
No.
He's been reincarnated. Yes, this is a hilarious story. I met this great old wise man who was a Buddha in Ladakh at the time
Mm.
when Ladakh was closed, but was just open to Westerners, and it
And
was
what was his name?
unbelievable. Tuksay Rinpoche,
Right.
and he changed my life because I could see that there was something happening in him that I'd never seen in anyone. And being a fellow of all souls, I'd met many extraordinary people. I met prime ministers and heads of industry and lord chancellors and all that
Mhm.
kind of thing, but none of them had ever had this majesty of presence. And to the end of my life, I would be supremely grateful that I knew him and touched his grandeur. And I became a Buddhist with him and under him. I was initiated into Mahayana Buddhism, and it really shifted everything. And I wrote my first book, Journey in Ladakh.
Mm.
But 35 years later, I didn't go back after his death, which was a couple of years later, to Ladakh because I just didn't want to see that world ruined. But I eventually did go back, and I heard that his incarnation was in town. So I sent him a message and said, "Well, I wrote this book about you in your last life. Can I come and see you?" And he wrote back, "Come, come, come." So I go,
How old is he?
and he's 29, and he was 27 at the time, I think. I go, I go to the monastery where he is. His secretary comes and says, "He'll see you now." And I go in, and he's standing by the window, and his back is to me, this very handsome, beautiful, dignified man. I could see, from the back. And then he turned, and his face changed for really 2 seconds. It was unmistakable, and it was the old face. And then he smiled, and he said, "How lovely to see you again."
Wow.
And then he said, "Well, in my last life, you were my son and I was your father. Now you're an old guy, so you have to be my father and I'll be your son, and you have to teach me." And we roared with laughter because the idea that I had anything to teach someone who'd already had 13 rounds of this mad world was very funny to me. It's an
Um,
amazing world that I entered. But then I became the disciple of a woman called Mother Mira, and that lasted 15 years, and it had many wonderful things about it, but it ended very tragically because I met the man who would become my husband, and I was so thrilled because I thought this was all her grace, but she turned out not to like it at all, to be homophobic and to say I couldn't, I had to become completely celibate and serve her, and there was no place for
mm.
gay people in the queendom of the mother. And I realized she couldn't possibly be the mother, because how could the mother of everyone deny the holiness and sanctity of gay people. We're just like everybody else, and that's it, right?
And so your kind of takeaway from it was that she had achieved a certain level of awareness, but she wasn't
You can't be
divine.
enlightened and be homophobic. You can have powers, and she certainly had powers, and she had many great qualities, really great qualities. But I think when you believe you are enlightened, you are lost, because enlightenment is not a static state.
Mm,
It's a field you get into, and it keeps expanding. And if you really know that field through grace, you know that to think that you've arrived is absurd, because there's always, always, always going to be more.
mm,
Because there's a wonderful story from the Sufis, ninth century Sufi called Dhul Nun, and he was very, very serious, this Dhul Nun, very intense and great, great mystic. And he had come to a very important stage in his path, and he was wrestling with this question: is there ever an end to the path? And he asked all kinds of very learned sheikhs, and they gave him all kinds of ponderous answers which bored him to death. And he couldn't get it out of his mind, this question, and he went into retreat. And he went into retreat by the sea. And one day he was walking by the sea, and he saw this mad woman, this mad gypsy woman dancing on the shore. And he realized that she knew the answer. So, with great reverence, he went up to her and said, is there any end to the transformations of the path? And she answered him by screaming with laughter.
mm,
And when she'd stopped shaking with laughter and all her rags shaking and everything, she said, how could there ever be an end to the transformations? Because love is infinite.
mm.
So the guru system is itself inherently flawed, because to claim that anyone has reached anything final and then has the right to tell everybody else what to do is a patriarchal fantasy. That's what this whole experience taught me.
So the book that you co-wrote with Sogyal Rinpoche, the
Yes.
Tibetan Book of the Living and the Dying, please tell me that you wrote it and not him, because then I can actually continue to like this book.
No, no, no. Sogyal had received the greatest teachings from the greatest Tibetan teachers. He'd had the most amazing teachers who really reared him.
Mm,
And he had an extraordinary assistant called Patrick Gaffney, who was a brilliant guy, is a brilliant guy, and had absorbed the teachings and wrote beautifully. And it was really a work between the three of us. Sogyal had the extraordinary knowledge, and so did Patrick. And I had been initiated into Tibetan Buddhism, and I'd read a lot, and I'd become friends with the Dalai Lama and gone to his teaching. So I was very, very imbued with the subject. And we wrote it together, and it became a seamless process. I wrote a
mm.
lot of it, but we worked on it. And then, of
So
course,
it's a
Sogyal was
co-writing.
disgraced
He was
because he
disgraced.
behaved very badly.
Did
Yeah,
you have a
terrible.
sense of that when in you?
No,
Mm,
it was I got the gorgeous side of him. He was very loving to me, he was very warm to me, he held me in his heart, and there is an amazing side of him. And then there was this absolutely tragically ghastly side, which I had absolutely no inkling of until the book came out, and then I started to meet some of the women that had been horribly abused, and I cut my association with him, but I have always remained very grateful for the experience, because it wasn't just Sogyal who poured all of this knowledge into the book. He took us to Nepal, and we met unspeakably great masters. I mean, Khyentse Rinpoche at the end of his life, and others, Tuku Ogyen, and these were mind-boggling people, because they'd sit around and we would be talking to them about the process of death, and they'd sit around like guys in a park, not figuratively smoking, not literally, and they'd talk about the dying process. Oh, what happened to you last time? Did you go around there? And it was like describing a walk around Hyde Park. So I got a sense of the extraordinary depth of the knowledge.
ah.
So I regret what Sogyal has done terribly, and I wish he was supposed to pay me for this book, which sold 3 million copies. I was supposed to get a percentage, no percentage.
Nothing. Oh
He spent it
no.
on one of his houses in God knows where. I mean, he was a naughty boy, but I got so much.
Oh dear.
I let it
Right.
go, blood under the bridge. But I'm
So
so sorry for what happened to the women, and I'm so sorry for all the hundreds
yeah.
of thousands of people that have been radically disillusioned by what
Mm,
it turned out he was up to. Mm.
mm. So I mean, talking about some of the issues in spiritual culture, um, one of the issues, which is obviously, and you've talked about this, is that spirituality can sometimes be a bit selfish. You wrote once about
Right.
bliss bunnies jacked into the IV of their own self-created mystical experiences, which I thought was a
Well, it sounds
pretty
like me, yes.
yeah.
Look, it's
So
very simple. You're not really attuned to divine love unless you're prepared to give everything in service to humanity and the world.
right.
So if you're on the path just to cheer yourself up and to discover reality, that's a good enough motive to begin with, and it will give you certain opening. But when you encounter really the presence, the glory of the presence, you realize that that presence has two aspects which are intertwined. It has a very great peace and it has a very great passion. It's dynamic. And
Mm,
that means that you are given these great gifts of self awareness, not just to sit on your cushion and savor the world, but to actually go out much stronger and create what John Lewis called good trouble and what I call radioactive mischief. It's time to turn up in the world, and especially in a world that is in an apocalyptic crisis that will determine the whole future of humanity. It's time to follow the example of the great mystical prophets like the prophet, peace be upon him, and Jesus and others, and really put love into action. You're never complete until you're serving.
I like this idea of serving, of reconnecting spirituality to this Christian tradition of service as well.
Yes,
But let me,
but it's in all the great traditions.
right,
Because the
yeah,
Buddhists have the vision of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is someone who comes back again and again to liberate all beings,
yeah,
including the last little flea and blade of grass. You have it in Hinduism when you have the vision of the Karma Yogi who gives
mm,
everything in service to humanity, in service to God. You have it, of course, in Taoism and in Confucianism, in all the great traditions. There is this, and in Islam. I mean, look at the Prophet. Peace be upon him, the greatest of sacred activists with Jesus. So it's the central message of all great
right,
mystics.
yes.
It's
But can I put a skeptical point regarding it? Like during
absolutely
the
not. How
pandemic,
dare you?
during the pandemic, have we not seen what happens when spiritual hippies try to get involved in politics? And
Yes.
they get,
What do you mean? Do you mean the
but they get
anti-vaxxers and
really
all that?
yeah,
Are
anti-vax,
you
or
kidding
you've
me?
got like, oh look, the millions of children are being trafficked. Let's get into QAnon. So we've
But
seen
that's
what
not,
happened.
that is a horrifying phenomenon. It's
Mm,
not, I would say it was 25% of the spiritual world, and it's lunatic fringe, and I've
yeah,
absolutely disavowed it.
yeah,
But
yeah,
a great many people have also woken up to the nature of what we're living through, that we're really entering the most dramatic, the most demanding. And I teach all over the world, and I've noticed that people's pulses are quickening, they're getting it, and they're really listening to the great activists like Greta Thunberg and others and the Dalai Lama himself, who's written this book called A Call for Revolution. When the Dalai Lama calls for revolution, that's worth listening to. And a lot of people are waking up and realizing that sacred activism, the movement I've created, is really the essential movement of our time. So you're right about the lunatics, and God bless them, and may they attain enlightenment soon, very, very soon. But don't miss out those amazing people who have been asleep but who are waking up and who are realizing that the world is in extreme danger now.
but
I mean, terminal danger
isn't there a
potentially.
small step from sacred activism to sacred violence?
No, not at all, because sacred activism is rooted in the profound visions of Gandhi and Martin Luther King and the Dalai Lama and Lech Walesa and all of those who know that the most powerful force on this planet is non-violent resistance.
Mm,
This is really the core of sacred activism. Violence
mm,
begets violence, and anyway, the people in power, the dark ones, have all the power. So if you're violent, you just get killed. When I I had interviewed the Dalai Lama on the day he won the Nobel Prize, and I said, "Well, what is all this about non-violence?" And he said, "It's very practical, actually, Andrew." He said, "Look, if I, as the Dalai Lama, said to the Tibetans, you've got to get up and shoot the Chinese would send in a 300,000 army and then they'd eliminate all the Tibetans they haven't killed already." So non-violence isn't going to work against the people who've got all the power. What can work, and we've seen it work in India with Gandhi, in America to a certain extent with Martin Luther King, and Solidarność with Lech Walesa, is a force that's impregnated with moral passion, resolutely committed to non-violence, but resolutely committed also to indomitable resistance. That's the most powerful force on earth.
I want to ask you about the new book, but just on that,
Yes, you
like,
must. Otherwise, I will never speak to you
yeah.
again.
So you saw the elite close up more than
Oh my
most,
God, it's enough to make you. It would have made, if I hadn't become a mystic, I would have become a Marxist revolutionary.
right? And so do
Yeah.
you? Because now there is this idea, that the elite, there's something deeply corrupt about them. That they're, to
Oh
what
God,
extent,
they're totally corrupt. Are you kidding me? They're completely corrupt.
But aren't you part
Anybody
of
who
the
hopes
elite?
for a
You're like
change in
friends
the
with
world from
Kofi
the elite.
Annan and Barbara Streisand. I mean, aren't you part of the elite?
Well, I'm not part of the elite. If you looked at my bank balance, you'd realize how funny that statement was. I may have a posh accent and all that kind of thing and a great education, but I'm not a member of the elite.
Mm,
No, I mean a member of another kind of elite, but it's not the elite.
mm,
And I don't believe in elites because the truth is, the further you go on the spiritual path, the more you know what a wreck you are, and the more you love everyone else and see God in everyone else. So, elite,
mm.
let's scrap that word. What is It's absolutely clear to me that if anyone hopes from any changes from any of the elites, they are out of their minds on crack. The only future can be built by grassroots, peaceful, loving revolution in the name of sacred activism. Greta Thunberg knows this. And
Mm.
Greta is our leading spiritual teacher with the Dalai Lama. This woman, this
Yeah,
girl,
she's amazing.
she's telling the truth on every level. I mean, she
Mm,
just gobsmacks me.
me too.
And
Yeah.
we're in touch, and she's an extraordinary, holy person. And she's talk about no bullshit. Have you ever seen anybody capable of just saying it as it is so flatly, simply, quietly that there's no argument? And
Yeah.
when she said about COP26, what did you think about COP26, which was a complete disaster, complete revelation of the complete bankruptcy of the elites? She just said, blah, blah, blah. And that said it all.
Mm.
But it's not over till the fat lady sings. There's a lot happening that is wonderful. This is a terrible crisis. We are in danger of extinction, but there are a great many people waking up and they're confused and bewildered and paralyzed by suffering and despairing. And then there's COVID, and then there's climate change, and then there's this and that. But this is an ordained crisis. It's got to happen to purify and clarify the human race. It's got to destroy all the old structures. It will. It'll be agony, but there's a very, very good chance that a great many half good people would get their act together, and come into a wholly new creativity and deep activism.
So just finally, your new book is called it's on Kabir and it's called Engoldenment.
Yes,
Now, I have
it's the
never read
best.
Kabir, so tell
Oh
us
my
why
God!
Kabir is so important now to us. How can
Oh my
why should
God!
we read this book and why should we get to know Kabir now?
Well, very simply, Kabir lived in the 15th century. He lived in a place which was then called Benares. He was a poor weaver, a poor Muslim weaver in a very holy Indian city. And in his 20s, probably, he woke up completely and realized that the Hindus were nuts, the Muslims were nuts. There was a direct connection possible with the divine, and that it wasn't only capable of enlightening you, waking you up, which is wonderful enough, but also of engoldening you. And that's what this book is dedicated to, which it's a book of 366 translations of Kabir. And it's a day book because I wanted people to really experience this extraordinary message of his, because I think it's the key to what we're going through now. He understood, Kabir, that we were in what he called Kali Yuga, the last turn of the wheel, and that things were going to get very much worse even than they were in his time. So he tells you the truth about what's going on. He understood too that we are going into the age of universal mysticism, going beyond the religions with their dogmas and their little games and their boys' clubs into direct, naked connection with the divine through humble, sacred practice. He understood too that this was possible on a global scale because he'd woken up as an ordinary person, not as some fancy schmancy Sanskrit priest or rich guy or rich girl. So he knew it was for everybody. And his poems were delivered for the first time in Indian history in the language of the people, which is why the people are completely crazy about him. He also, and this is what's really important, this is why this book thrills me that finally, it took me many years to translated. He's very hard to translate because he's incredibly simple. The simplest things are the hardest to, so I had to really work on myself to become clear enough to be able to begin to transmit him. He understood that the destiny of humanity was to go to the next evolutionary level, to be engolden, to be born as a consciously human and consciously divine humanity. And this I've discovered through my 30 years of research in all of the major traditions is the actual hidden secret of all of the traditions. They all know this, but for many thousands of years, it's been kept secret for a few adepts because it was considered very radioactive stuff to give to people before they were ready. But now it's my task and the task of a few other mystics like myself to give these secrets to the world because we're in a global dark night crisis whose secret purpose is to birth the next level of our evolutionary truth, our engoldenment. And what engoldenment is very simply is the divinization of mind, heart, soul, and body all together to bring you into a completely new radiance of embodied presence. And I've tasted the beginnings of this process. I know that it's real. I had a teacher, my greatest teacher, Father Bede Griffiths, who was living this process at the end of his life with awe and wonder and communicated to me great secrets about it, which I've given to everybody in my work. And I found in Kabir the full map to this process. So that's what is this book, my friends. It costs $14.99. The cost of a mediocre breakfast. You could have the full map to engoldenment for a mediocre breakfast, thanks to your old broken down uncle Andrew Harvey.
Andrew, just finally, would you read us a little bit of Kabir?
Yes, absolutely. I'll read you the poem. I'll read you one poem, which is his engoldenment poem. And this is an incredible poem because this is the poem about the moment when you realize you're not just being woken up in your consciousness to divine reality, which is an amazing experience. And many millions of people have had it. I've had it, and you never get over it. It's so extraordinary because everything is light, crystallized light. And you know that after this experience. But in the next stage of the unfolding of the path, you wake up to the fact that that light is living in you as you. And not only is it living in you as you, but it's transforming your mind, your heart, your soul, but also the cellular structure of your body. Your body is becoming engoldened by it. And there is a moment when this becomes absolutely clear to you and you are just obliterated with rapture. And this is the moment of that obliteration with rapture, by rapture. God, I was an Oxford scholar, obliterated with rapture. My God, imagine what they would say.
No, that was a good setup.
I know.
I can't wait.
It's very short. It begins with this line, and I explain the line because it's important. He begins with conch, gong, trumpet. And what that means is as you wake up on the mystical path, you realize that there are many sounds that the divine presence has, and there can be many things: sounds of bees, sounds of symbols, and then eventually it becomes a very a constant calm sound. And this has been heard by millions of people. I'm not the only one who does it. This is known in the mystical traditions. Then after that, if you work with that, then the Engoldenment process starts, and suddenly it's like hearing Beethoven. It's like hearing an orchestra, a vast, vast orchestra. And he uses conch, gong, trumpet because those are the instruments that announce the coming back into a temple of a temple idol of the gods. That happens when you are godded by God. I mean, you're just a tiny godette. You're not a big god. You're just a hologram. You're a light drop of the infinite ocean. So it's not you don't become grandiose, but just thrilled.
Yeah.
And, this is why he has that. Conch, gong, trumpet, hear them thrilling through the divine palace of your body. Your body. As at long last, you merge with your eternal husband. Let love's mad joy surge through your whole being in wave after wave. This is what you were born for. This is what you died to. That's it. That's the next stage of human evolution. He got there fast.
Wow. Lovely. Well, that is a great taste. I want to discover more about Kabir now.
You
He
buy
sounds
this book,
remarkable.
honestly, this book I'm not saying that because I spent years making this book possible, and I'm so thrilled it's available. It's the book that can guide you through what we're living through, this great death that is the birth canal for this great birth, this Engoldenment birth. And you don't have to believe me because you might see that I'm quite obviously a bit, out of it, but believe him, he knows. That guy knew and knows, and everybody in the spiritual world is now buying this book because they know that Kabir is amazing, but they don't know quite yet how amazing. And that's what my job was, to really present the Everest of mystics as a guide for right now. That's why I put it into 365 poems. So you could have Kabir every day to accompany you as you go through this monumental agony, which is an agony, not a death, I believe, but a birth.
We all need that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all your work, for all these over 30 books you've done, all the work you've done to
42, my friend, 42. Let's get accurate.
To reconnect us to the great mystics, even us dried up old English.
Oh, you're not dried up. You've survived, but Costa Rica is obviously helping. Yeah.
Yeah, that's helping with my engoldening.
Yeah, no, in Golden Away, it's the only game in town because there is something amazing happening. And if you dare to imagine it and work with it in the way Kabir suggests, which is very simple, you can feel it. It's happening. This is not poetry. This is something that actually all the great evolutionary mystics in all the traditions knew would happen. It's happening. We're there. Let's get with the Row program.
God bless, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend. Lovely to talk to you. Be good. And if you can't be good, as my mother would say, be clever.
Lovely to see you.
God bless you. Lovely
God
to
bless.
see you.
Bye.